Welcome to the Houdini HOULY Challenge Series. So, SideFX is holding a 31-day challenge where artists create a piece per day based on a daily topic. I've decided to take on the challenge and record each day's work so that you can see the process. I'm doing this so that I can challenge myself, and I'd recommend that you do the same. So, let's get straight into it. Hey. So, today is day 9. That means we're doing growth. Ever since I started in Houdini, I loved growth solvers. I think it's a man versus machine thing. I think that's where the obsession started. And the first things that I tried were all growth solver related. I tried to do knitting patterns and all of that, and that evolved into growth patterns. And the idea for this one, I saw a tree, and I was like, okay, nature, great. All right, Mother Nature, let's do Mother Nature. So let's get straight into it. Alright, so let me take you through the setup. So I actually took the easy way out on this one. This is basically the setup that I used for a tutorial that I did on Patreon. It was the Hennessy 7 Worlds tutorial, where I go over one of the effects from the Hennessy 7 Worlds ad, which is the one where there's like this powdered paint hitting this character, and where the paint hits, growth starts. So it grows out from those points. I decided to just basically reuse it, but add a couple of things to it. I added moss, I changed the growth pattern, I included some hair growth, so the vines grow as hair, and I can show you what I have. The one issue that I had when I started was that I needed a female base mesh. Right? I wanted this to be Mother Nature, and so I needed a very feminine look to it. Now the issue is, you have to use Houdini to make all of your geometry, which is fine, but Houdini for sculpting is not fun. Houdini does not have a good sculpting toolset. So creating anything organic is not easy, and creating a female face, very much not easy. So I took the next best thing to a feminine base mesh. I took your boy Tommy. And so I'm sorry Tommy, but I had to turn him into Tammy. What I did was deleted everything that wasn't part of the body mesh, booleaned it so you just have the bust, booleaned again in half so that you can work on one half, and then at the end you can mirror it. Then I did some edits, and I wish I recorded this. This was by far the most entertaining part of the series. I wish I had it. Basically, I had to edit it to make him look more feminine. That means removing these ridiculously massive muscles. So you can see this is like halfway through where I narrow the neck, bring in the jawline, and so bring in the shoulders a bit, but I still have this massive back muscle. And so I had to do some more changes, change the facial structure, brought in that point over there at the back of the head. And what I realized doing this was that I have no idea what a woman looks like. Eventually I ended up with this weird looking alien lady. Mirror it over, polyfill, and then use this sphere in the mouth to remove the mouth bag. VDB from polygons, convert, attribute blur to smooth it, and you end up with this. And then over on the side, there's a draw curve and things. This was messy. This wasn't great, but I ended up with some hair that I could use as vines. So then that goes into its own setup. But I want to show you basically just the growth setup. The idea behind a growth pattern is as follows. You have a bunch of points, right? Or this is at least the basic growth solver idea. And you have one that is infected. So this is where you would start your growth solver from. Then this looks for neighbors. So let me just draw in a radius for you. So all of these get caught in the radius. So those are points that can be infected, right? Then you have some sort of condition. Maybe the condition is it can only infect 3 near points, right? So it infects this one over here, this one over here, and this one over here. And then you have other options, like should they connect? And then you can connect them with a primitive. And then these two don't get connected. Then you run the same thing on those points out there. Great, but infected points can't infect each other. So that stops them from doing things like connecting back onto themselves. So you end up with things like this. And it makes for a very interesting looking effect. And so you can give conditions. That's what drives the growth, right? So you can say things like only go up or only go along a certain path. Or you can have things like a cost attribute. So maybe you wanted to only get driven along a certain way, a certain direction. So that's the idea behind a basic growth solver. In this setup, I start by creating some guidelines, right? Where it should run along. So that's this over here. Unroll, which gives you a wireframe. Then you resample and you attribute blur, so it smooths it out. And then you resample it again, fuse any points, do a bit of a noise, and then ray it back down so that stays on the geometry, so you end up with that. And then on the other side, it's this thing that goes into a pop network over here, where basically you shoot points from the front to the back and then connect them up, right? It generates that. So that gets time shifted and merged together, so you end up with this. This is what it starts to grow from. It's the basis. You plug that into a solver. The solver does some calculations. It grows it from a single point that I define over here. So I choose that little point on the forehead. That's why the growth starts there. I could start it anywhere. And then over here you can see that grows out. And this is exactly what I used in the Hennessy 7 Worlds tutorial. But then I make some minor adjustments. It grows out like that based on near points. On the other side, you have another solver. This one is the one that connects 3 points together. So you can see over here, it basically just checks for near points. If a near point's growth value isn't 1, then you can connect it. So growing points connect to each other. You end up with this over here. What I do is I also add some noise to the leading edge. So I have an edge attribute that you can also visualize, actually. The edge attribute's always useful. I like to have an edge attribute so that you can actually see where the leading edge is, so that you can do progressive effects, like that drives the noise. So you can see over here, I drive noise based on edge. Before that, it's just smooth, right? So it just grows out like this, which is kind of boring. But because we have that leading edge, you can apply noise and multiply it by the leading edge. It looks a lot more organic and nice. And then you output that as undergrowth. So this is the undergrowth. So it looks pretty cool. Then I take that hair over here on the side. That gets output as well. There's nothing fancy about that. It's just some curves. And I then have 4 different parts to this. You have the vines, which is the hair. So I'm going to show you the hair vines because that's kind of interesting actually. Curves. And then transfer normals onto it. That becomes useful later because you kind of want to push them away from the surface, or else they go inside of the head, and that's not very good looking. Resample it, do a carve. This one I actually keyframed. I decided to just keyframe it because I knew when I wanted them to grow. So carve it like that, give it a rest attribute. I don't even think I used that, but it's useful to have rest. It's basically cheap UVs. That's basically what a rest attribute is. And so into the solver, this one, very basic. All I'm doing is I'm transferring a growth attribute and then increasing it. So as a point gets added, its growth attribute resets. So points that are new have a lower growth attribute. What that means is that as they grow, I can decide how thick they should be. Anyways, after that, I do some things with p-scale and the growth value. You ray it back onto the surface to a polywire. So as you can see, they start out thin, and then as they grow, they get thicker, right? Pretty cool. And it also has a curve U attribute, which is useful because you can make the roots, so the base areas, very narrow. So it looks like it's coming out of a sculpt. And then you can make those areas thicker. Attribute noise to make it look more like roots. Then I push it by the normals, which got renamed to push. And then you promote your rest attribute because I thought I would use it in Redshift, but I don't know if I did. This main growth, I just turn into a polywire, once again, using that leading edge to define, you can see it over here, edge equals fit edge 0, 1, 0, 1, p-scale equals that edge times 0.05. So I'm using that so that as we go, this thickens, right? So it starts thin at the back. You can see this starts really thin over there and gets thicker. File cache that out, and then over here is undergrowth. Nothing changed about this one. But the interesting thing is that when you render this out, you can actually use Redshift's strands so that you can turn it from curves like this, lines, into cylindrical, kind of like a polywire. So I can show you that if we go into render view. So then I also have this thing, I just called it geometry. I was lazy at this point, I think. What it does is I create a noise attribute called density onto this face geometry. Do a scatter so that it's based on density. So I'm scattering based on density. You can see it over there. Attribute blur it so that it's smoother. P-gen and point jitter so that there's more points. Right? Ray it to the surface, just like that. And then the solver over here is the exact same one that I used for the growth, the undergrowth. So it's this one over here. But instead of connecting, all it's doing is adding attributes. So if we go to geometry, take a look inside, you can see this one's super simple. This one, I'm just saying, this is the distance to search, this is the number of points to find. If your growth value is 1, then look for some near points based on the distance and number of points that you're allowed to find. For each of those points that you find, if that point's growth value is equal to 0, then give it an edge value, and also give it a growth value. And then I believe at the bottom, yeah, I just divide edge by 1.1, so that edge fades off over time. So every time the solver runs, edge fades off, but growth is constant. So these two are kind of similar, but not really. What happens is growth is more of true or false, right? Has this point been infected? Yes or no, right? There's no in-between value for that. Edge, however, is how long ago were you infected? Anyways, so I take that out, I delete points that are not infected, and I've made a mistake. I delete points that are not infected, so you can see it only keeps those. VDB from particles, convert VDB, file cache, you end up with this. And what I'm using to drive the infection of this, because it needs to start somewhere, right? I don't start it with a point like I did with the other one. I bring in the undergrowth. So these lines, these become the ones driving that. So you can actually see this over here. If I switch on solver and the delete node, you can see that only where it's touching, it's growing. So that means that it won't grow over at the back, like it won't jump ahead or anything like that. It's controlled by another solver. So once you have all of that, time shift that, you get some moss. But yeah, that's all for this one. I will see you tomorrow for slow-mo, which I have high hopes for, but I don't know yet, so we'll see. Bye.